The day Inez Whitaker rode into Caldwell, Kansas, the sky was the color of a bruise healing wrong, and every man on the main street stopped what he was doing to watch her come. It was the spring of 1878, and Caldwell sat on the edge of everything, the last real town before the Kishom Trail opened up its wide, indifferent throat and swallowed cattle drives whole. The buildings were rough-hewn and sun-bleached. The boardwalks tilted at angles that suggested the earth beneath them had grown tired of holding still. A barber shop, a general store, a saloon called the Dusty Rose that smelled of whiskey and old ambition, and a jail that seemed to get more use than any other structure in town. It was not a beautiful place, but it was a place where a person could disappear into the noise of daily surviving, and that suited Inez just fine. She was 26 years old, with dark hair pinned under a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better decades, and brown eyes that moved quickly over everything the way eyes do when they have learned not to trust a landscape at first glance. She wore a plain traveling dress that was the color of dry grass, and the carpetbag strapped behind her saddle held everything she owned in the world, which was not very much. She had come from Wichita on the advice of a woman she'd met at a boarding house, a woman who'd said that the ranches south of Caldwell were always hiring for domestic work, cooking, mending, keeping house for men who'd rather wrestle a steer than boil a potato. Inez needed work. She had been a school teacher in Missouri once, in another life, before that life had come apart at its seams. She did not think about Missouri if she could help it. She thought about the road ahead, and what it might hold, and whether the sky would hold its rain until she found a roof. The first person to speak to her in Caldwell was a wiry old man named Hector Prout, who ran the livery stable, and seemed to believe it was his civic duty to inform newcomers of everything that was wrong with the town. "You looking for work, miss?" he called from beneath the wide shadow of the stable overhang. "I am," she said, climbing down from her horse with the practiced ease of someone who had done a great deal of riding she hadn't anticipated doing. "Turner Ranch is hiring," Hector said, and he said it the way a person says something they are only half sure about, like a man offering directions to a road he hasn't walked himself. "Though I'll say plainly it ain't the most cheerful place in the county." "I'm not looking for cheerful," Inez said. "I'm looking for steady." Hector worked his jaw thoughtfully. "Well, you'll get steady all right. Louis Turner runs a tight operation. Best cattle man in this part of Kansas, some would say. Built that ranch from nothing after the war, but he's a quiet man, real quiet. Some of the women who have tried to cook for him have packed up inside a week. Says he doesn't like company." Inez looked at the man steadily. "I'm not company," she said. "I'm hired help." Hector seemed to find this answer satisfactory. He told her to follow the south road for 6 miles until she hit the creek crossing, then bear west until she saw the fence line of cedar posts. She could not miss the main house. It was the only 2-story building between the creek and the Colorado border, he said, which was likely an exaggeration, but turned out to be close enough to true. She found the Turner Ranch in the late afternoon when the light was going gold and reluctant, the way light does when it knows the night ahead will be cold. The house was not elegant, but it was solid hand-hewn timber frame with a wide covered porch, a stone chimney, a barn that was newer than the house and better maintained. The cattle in the south pasture were fat and orderly. Everything about the place spoke of a man who worked with purpose and kept his intentions to himself. There were 2 ranch hands mending fence near the gate when she arrived. They looked at her with the open curiosity of men who don't see many strangers, and one of them, a young freckled fellow of maybe 19 named Darnell, offered to take her horse while the other went to find the boss. Louis Turner came around the side of the barn with his sleeves rolled to the elbow and a look on his face like a man who was prepared for the world to inconvenience him in one of a dozen predictable ways. He stopped when he saw Inez. She saw something shift behind his eyes quickly and then settle back into that careful stillness. He was 34 years old, and the western sun had done its honest work on him. He was tall and lean in the way of men who work with their hands every day, not for vanity but for survival. He had dark brown hair going a little gray at the temples, a jaw that looked like it had been set against something for a long time, and green eyes that were startling in their clarity, the kind of eyes you didn't expect in a face that had otherwise decided to hide everything it knew. He looked at her the way you look at something you hadn't planned for and weren't sure yet whether it was trouble. "Hector Prout sent me," she said before he could speak. "He said you were looking for a cook and housekeeper. I'm Inez Whitaker. I'm good in a kitchen. I can mend, I can keep accounts if you need it, and I won't bother you with unnecessary conversation." He was quiet for a moment, regarding her with those clear, guarded eyes. "Room and board plus $3 a week," he said finally. "Breakfast at 5:30, dinner at noon, supper at 6. I don't want anyone touching my office desk." "Agreed," she said. He nodded once, and that was the interview. He turned and walked back toward the barn, and Darnell showed her to the small room off the kitchen that would be hers, and Inez Whitaker unpacked her carpetbag and began building a life from the outside in, the only way she knew how. The first week was exactly as Hector had described it. Louis Turner was quiet in a way that was not merely personal preference but something deeper, something structural, like a house whose doors have been nailed shut so long that even the hinges have forgotten their function. He came to meals, ate what she cooked, said thank you with the minimal syllables required, and disappeared back into the work of the ranch. He did not ask her anything about herself. He did not volunteer anything about himself. He spoke to his ranch hands with crisp, functional authority, and they clearly respected him the way men respect a person who knows what he is doing and holds himself to it. Darnell, the young freckled hand, was more talkative. He had been with the ranch for 2 years and considered himself something of an authority on Louis Turner's habits, though he was careful about which things he said out loud and which things he kept in the general direction of a look. "He lost somebody," Darnell told Inez one morning while she was churning butter on the porch and he was supposed to be splitting wood. "7 years ago, give or take. Before my time here, but the older hands mention it sometimes. His wife. I don't know what happened exactly, but whatever it was, it ended him talking about her. Nobody even says her name anymore. Not around him, anyway." Inez kept churning and said nothing. She understood the architecture of grief well enough. She had her own corners she did not enter. "I'm just saying so you know," Darnell said, going back to his axe. "He's not cold because he's mean. He's just sealed up. Like a well someone covered over." She thought about that for a while. A well someone covered over. It was a fair description, she thought. You could see the stone of it, the careful construction. You just couldn't reach the water. By the end of the second week, Inez had learned the rhythms of the Turner Ranch as thoroughly as she had once learned the rhythms of a schoolroom. She knew that Louis took his coffee black, and that he would drink it cold if it was there and he was working and hadn't noticed the time. She knew that he went to the barn every night before sleeping, not because the animals needed him, but because he needed them or needed the silence of them, the uncomplicated warmth of horses breathing in the dark. She knew that on Sunday mornings he sat at the kitchen table for exactly 45 minutes with a ledger book and a pencil, and that he would stop sometimes in the middle of a column of numbers and go very still, looking at something that was not in the room, and then come back to himself and continue. She did not intrude on those moments. She had learned in her own years of navigating loss that some silences were not empty but full to the breaking point, and that company, however well-intentioned, was sometimes just pressure added to an already pressured thing. She did her work with care and without fuss. She made the kind of meals that men who work hard all day require: solid, warming, honest food. She kept the house clean and the accounts straight, because she had looked at them and seen that Louis did them himself but had made the same arithmetic error in the household column for 3 months running, and she corrected it quietly and left the ledger where he would find it. He never mentioned it, but the error did not appear again. In the third week, something small shifted. She had been baking bread on a Tuesday afternoon, and the kitchen had filled with that particular kind of warmth that bread makes, rich and yeasty and ancient in its comfort. And Louis had come in for water from the pump and stopped in the kitchen doorway for a moment in a way he usually did not stop. He usually moved through the kitchen with the efficiency of a man passing through, not staying. But he stopped there, and his face did something she couldn't fully read, and he said, quietly, almost more to himself than to her, "That smells like Sunday." She looked at him, and he seemed to realize he had said it out loud, and he went very still the way a man goes still when he has accidentally let something loose. "Sundays," she said carefully, not making much of it, just acknowledging it the way you acknowledge a bird that's landed near you, not wanting to startle it off. "Something good baking. That's the whole religion of it, I think." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved across those green eyes. And then he said, "Yes," and went and got his water and left. But that evening at supper he asked her where she had learned to cook, and she told him about her grandmother's kitchen in Missouri, and he listened in that careful way he had, and when she finished he said, "Missouri. That's a long way to come." "It is," she said. And that was all. But it was more than anything had been before, and she noticed it the way you notice a single lamp lit in a window you've been watching stay dark. The next few weeks continued in this careful, incremental way, like a thaw that happens so gradually you can't point to the moment the ice became water. He began to stay at the table a few minutes longer after supper. He asked her once how she'd learned to keep accounts, and she told him about the schoolhouse, and he asked what had brought her west, and she gave him the short version, the one without the grief in it. Her school had closed. The town had emptied after the railroad bypassed it. She had found herself at a crossroads with more road behind her than ahead, and she had chosen ahead. He nodded at this as though it made a particular kind of sense to him. She did not ask him about his wife. She did not ask him about the sealed-up well of himself. She let him be what he was, and she was what she was, and between those two things a kind of ease began to grow that neither of them had planned or particularly expected. The ranch hands noticed, of course. Men who work outdoors all day develop a fine antenna for the weather indoors. Darnell took to grinning at inappropriate moments when Inez came out to bring them water during the afternoon work. The other full-time hand, a taciturn man of 40 named Amos who had come up from Texas and had the weathered squint to prove it, said nothing at all but started bringing in the most presentable-looking firewood when he brought it to the kitchen door, as if somehow this mattered. Inez chose not to examine what she herself was feeling too closely, because she had learned that examining feelings too early was a good way to frighten them off before they knew what they were. She let herself notice small things and left the larger things in the general category of not yet. She noticed that his hands were careful, that he was patient with the horses in a way he was patient with very little else, not impatient exactly with other things, but with the horses he was different, slower, more willing to be still. She noticed that he read, which surprised her, because the shelf of books in his office was not merely decorative. She had dusted them and seen their cracked spines. He read history and surveying maps and one book of poetry that sat separate from the others, slightly apart, and she had not touched that one because it felt private in a way that was different from the rest. She noticed that he laughed once at something Darnell said at supper, and it was a short sound, unpracticed, like something that had climbed out before he could stop it. He looked surprised by it himself. But for a moment his face was young and unguarded, and she found that moment returning to her at odd hours. It was in the 5th week that the difficulty came. A man rode in one afternoon, a heavy man in a brown coat, riding a good horse with the easy arrogance of someone who owns enough land that other people's land seems like a temporary condition. His name was George Breckenridge, and he owned the largest spread north of the creek, and he had been making slow, persistent offers for the southern parcels of Turner's land for the better part of 2 years, according to Darnell, who had told Inez this with the hushed significance of a person who considers it important backstory. Breckenridge tied his horse at the post and walked to the porch with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who considers his own arrival to be the main event of any occasion he attends. Louis came out to meet him, and Inez, who was on the porch with a basket of beans to string, caught the minute change in his posture. Something that drew in, tightened, composed itself. "Turner," Breckenridge said. "Breckenridge," Louis said. The economy of it was its own language. Breckenridge's eyes slid to Inez with a frank appraisal that she had learned, over years, to receive without visible reaction. "New housekeeper," he said. "Miss Whitaker," Louis said, and his voice on her name had something in it she couldn't quite name, a deliberateness, a slight firmness, as though he were drawing a line without drawing attention to drawing it. Breckenridge tipped his hat at her with a sort of theatrical courtesy, and then turned back to Louis with the manner of a man getting to business. "I'll come straight to it," he said. "I'll offer you 1,800 for the South Creek parcel. That's 200 more than my last offer, and I think you know it's a fair price for land that floods twice a year." "I'm not selling," Louis said. "Louis." Breckenridge said his name with the patient tolerance of someone correcting a child's arithmetic. "That land has been fallow for 3 seasons. You haven't got the hands to work it properly. What use is it to you?" "It's mine," Louis said, "just that." Breckenridge looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was half irritation and half something more calculating. "I'll leave the offer on the table," he said. "It'll keep its own company there," Louis said. Breckenridge glanced at Inez again, as though she were somehow a variable in an equation he was still working out, and then he untied his horse and rode back the way he had come, and the quality of the air on the porch changed perceptibly once he was gone, the way air changes when a pressure system has passed. Louis stayed standing at the edge of the porch for a moment, watching the direction Breckenridge had gone. "He'll come back," he said, not exactly to her, but not to her either. "Men like that always do," she said, and went back to her beans. He turned and looked at her, and there was something almost like gratitude in the look, brief and unsurprised, as if she had confirmed something he already knew but was glad to have confirmed. After supper that evening, when the ranch hands had gone to the bunkhouse and the dishes were done and the kitchen had settled into its good nighttime silence, Louis stopped in the kitchen doorway instead of going straight to the barn. "That parcel he wants," he said. "It was where I planned to put the kitchen garden. When I first built the house, I had plans for it." She set down the pot she was drying and looked at him. He was looking at the middle distance, at the window and what was beyond it, which was the dark. "Plans keep," she said. He looked at her then directly, and she saw in those green eyes something that she had been cautiously circling for weeks, something real and unguarded, and it was not grief exactly, though grief was part of it. It was the particular loneliness of a person who has been strong so long they have forgotten that strength was supposed to be in service of something. "Yes," he said. "I suppose they do." He went to the barn. She listened to his boots on the porch steps, and then the quiet of the night settled back down, and she stood in the warm kitchen for a moment longer than necessary, just standing there in the light. On a Saturday in the 6th week, a situation arose that required more of Louis Turner than his usual studied composure. Inez had ridden into Caldwell for supplies, taking the buckboard herself because Louis was occupied with a fence that had come down in the north pasture, and Darnell and Amos were both needed for it. It was not unusual for her to go alone. She was capable, and the road was not difficult. But what was unusual was what she found in Caldwell when she got there. George Breckenridge was at the general store when she arrived, and he was in the company of 2 men she didn't know, broad-shouldered men with the careful ease of people who are accustomed to being the largest and most dangerous things in any room. Breckenridge greeted her with the excessive courtesy he seemed to reserve for women he considered peripheral to important matters, and then mentioned, as though it were a pleasant conversational subject, that he had recently acquired a very useful piece of information about the South Creek parcel. "Turns out the original land survey from 1869 has a discrepancy," he said pleasantly, leaning against the counter with his hat in his hand. The parcel boundary runs about 40 yards east of where Turner thinks it does, which puts a good piece of that fence line on county land. His fences aren't properly registered. Inez looked at him. She had been a school teacher. She knew how to look at a person who was telling a partial truth and presenting it as the whole of one. I imagine Mr. Turner will be interested to see that survey, she said. I imagine he will, Breckenridge said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I've already filed the relevant paperwork with the county office in Wellington, just doing my civic duty. She bought her supplies without further conversation and drove back to the ranch with a very specific set of thoughts arranged in a straight, clear line. When she told Louis what Breckenridge had said, standing in the barn while he wiped his hands on a rag and listened without expression, she saw the muscle in his jaw work once, and then he was still. I know about the survey discrepancy, he said. She waited. It's not what he says it is. The 1869 survey has an error in the original notation. The benchmark tree used was blown down in the drought of '72, and the county resurveyed in '74 and corrected it. I have the documentation. Then he knows he's bluffing, she said. He's hoping I don't know what I have, Louis said, and for the first time she heard something that was not quite anger but was adjacent to it, a clean, focused thing, like a knife edge rather than a bludgeon. Where are your documents? Office desk, he said, and then looked at her, remembering what he'd said when she arrived about not wanting anyone to touch his desk, and something changed in his face, not embarrassment exactly, but an acknowledgement. If you want, she said, I can help you organize what you have and draft a response to the county office. I kept records for the school district for 2 years. I know how these filings work. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I'll find the documents. They worked at the kitchen table that evening, Louis bringing papers from the office and Inez organizing them with the methodical competence she applied to everything. And somewhere around 9 o'clock he said, You don't have to do this, and she said, I know, and he said nothing more but moved his chair slightly so they could both see the same document. And that small movement, the simple practical closing of distance, felt like something with weight and consequence. The response to the county was drafted and sent with the next post rider, and within a week the county surveyor's office in Wellington confirmed that the 1874 survey superseded the 1869 notation, and Breckenridge's filing was formally rejected. He did not come back to the ranch after that, and while Inez suspected this was not the end of his interest, it was at least the end of that particular chapter of it. But something had changed between that evening at the kitchen table and every evening after it. The careful, measured distance that both of them had been maintaining, each for their own reasons, had grown less careful. Not reckless, neither of them was a reckless person, but less deliberate about itself. He started talking to her in the evenings. Not much, and not about the things that mattered most, but about the ranch, the cattle market, what he thought the summer would bring for the grass, whether the new well he was planning to dig in the east pasture would hit water at 20 feet or 40. She talked back about the accounts, about what she had noticed, about a recipe she was planning to try with the dried peppers that had come in the last supply order, about a letter she had gotten from a woman she had known in Wichita who was apparently now living in Denver and finding it agreeable. The evenings began to feel like something. Neither of them said so. Neither of them needed to. It was Amos who brought it into the open in the blunt, practical way that Amos brought everything into the open, which was to say, without any particular delicacy, but without malice either. He had come to the kitchen door one morning to drop off the firewood, and Inez was inside making breakfast, and he set down the wood and said, in the same tone he would have discussed the weather or the condition of the south fence, You know he watches for you. From the barn when you come back from town. Stands there in the door just watching the road until you come around the bend. Inez kept cracking eggs. Amos, she said, I'm just saying what I see, he said, and went back to his work. She cracked the last egg and stared at the pan for a moment and then put it on the heat. That afternoon she was hanging laundry on the line between the house and the cottonwood tree when Louis came from the direction of the barn and stopped about 10 feet away, looking at the ground as though he were reading something written there. "I owe you," he said without preamble. She turned and looked at him. "For the county filing." "For all of it, that land," he stopped, looked up at the sky for a moment, then back at her. "That land is important to me for reasons that aren't entirely practical, and I should have said before that I was grateful." "You said thank you," she pointed out. "I said thank you for supper," he said. "That's different." She held a shirt in her hands that she hadn't finished hanging. She looked at him in the afternoon light, this man who was sealed up like a covered well, who had been standing in a barn door watching for her, who made her feel, for the first time in a long time, that the road ahead was more interesting than she had anticipated. "Then I accept your gratitude," she said, "and I hope the land turns out to be everything you planned it for." He looked at her steadily. Then he said quietly, "I'd like to tell you what I planned it for, sometime, if you wanted to know." "I would," she said. He nodded and went back to his work, and Inez hung the shirt on the line and stood there for a moment with the prairie wind moving through everything, and she thought that whatever she had decided not to examine too closely was rapidly reaching the point where it was going to demand examination whether she invited it or not. On a Sunday evening 3 days later, after the ranch hands had gone to the bunkhouse, and the supper dishes were washed and the kitchen was clean, Louis came to the porch where Inez was sitting watching the last light leave the sky, and he sat in the other chair, the one that had sat empty since she arrived, and he told her about the South Creek parcel. He told her that when he had come to this land in 1869, a year out of the war and with nothing to his name but a land grant and a stubbornness that his mother had always told him would either save him or ruin him, he had stood on that parcel and thought about what he wanted to build. Not just the ranch, something whole. A house with a kitchen garden, cattle in the south pasture, children who would know this particular bend of the creek, this particular quality of light in October. He had met his wife 2 years later in a town called Pratt, where she was working in her uncle's dry goods store and had red hair and opinions about everything, and made him feel, for the first time since the war, that the future was something to lean toward rather than just survive. He said her name very quietly, as though he were picking up something he had been afraid was too fragile to hold. Her name was Clara. He said she had died in the winter of 1871, 3 months after their wedding, of a fever that came on fast and was over fast. He had been out at the south pasture when it took its worst turn, and by the time Amos had ridden out to find him, there was not enough time to do more than be present at the end of it. She was 23 years old. He was 27. He said he had not spoken her name aloud in 7 years. Not to the ranch hands, not to Hector Prout, not to the pastor in Caldwell who had tried twice to have a conversation about it, not to anyone. Her name had lived inside him in that sealed-up place, too large and too tender to be brought into the air, where the world might do something ordinary and terrible to it, like absorb it the way the prairie absorbs everything, without acknowledgement. Inez sat very still while he told her this. The sky had gone from gold to amber to a deep, settling blue, and the first stars were appearing the way they do out in that open country, one by one, as if each one were making a personal decision. "I'm sorry," she said, when he had been quiet for a while. She said it simply, without embellishment, because she knew that large grief does not require commentary, just witness. He nodded. His hands were on his knees still, and there was something about him in that moment that was less armored than she had seen him, not broken but opened, the way ground opens in spring after a long winter, not destroyed but changed, ready for something. "The reason I couldn't sell the parcel," he said, "is that I planted a plum tree on it that spring before she died. She liked plums, it's still there, it still bears fruit." Inez looked at the stars for a moment. "That's a good reason," she said. "I know it's just a tree," he said. "No," she said quietly, "it's not just a tree, it's the plan you made together. Those don't disappear because the person does." He looked at her then, and there was something in those clear green eyes that was not just grief anymore, not just that, but something that sat alongside the grief and was different from it, warmer, more present, pointed at her. "Tell me something about yourself," he said. "Something you don't usually tell." She was quiet for a moment. Then she told him about her husband, Thomas Whitaker, who had died in 1874 of a kick from a horse that had seemed like a small injury and had turned, over 3 terrible days, into something that was not small at all. She had been 22. They had been married 8 months. She had loved him in the way you love a person when you are young and have not yet learned how much love costs, which is to say fully and without any of the caution that comes after. After he died, she had gone back to teaching school because it was the only thing she had that was fully her own, and she had taught for 2 more years until the school closed, and then she had simply been moving, finding one steady thing after another, because motion was easier than stopping. "We're both people who have been moving," he said. "Yes," she said, "though I'm not sure I want to keep moving." The silence that followed was not empty. He reached over, slowly and carefully, and covered her hand on the armrest with his. His hand was rough with work and warm, and she did not pull away, and they sat like that while the stars finished arriving and the prairie settled into its vast, quiet dark, and neither of them said anything else because nothing else needed saying just yet. The days that followed had a different quality. Not dramatically so, they were not people who traded in drama, but different in the way a room is different when 2 people in it have admitted, without many words, that there is something between them that neither of them intends to walk away from. He brought her wildflowers once, not presented as a romantic gesture with the accompanying self-consciousness that makes such things awkward, but set on the kitchen windowsill the way you set something down in a place where it will be seen, and said, "Found these coming up along the creek line." And she had put them in a jar of water and thanked him as if this were a natural and ordinary thing, because it was. She made plum preserves from the fruit of the tree on the south parcel. He came in one morning and found her at the stove and looked at the jar she had set on the counter and was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I hope that's all right." There were so many, and they were going to fall, and he said, "It's more than all right," and his voice was rough with something she understood. Darnell, who was 19 and romantic in the way that young men are before life has complicated their romantic inclinations, started walking around the ranch with the expression of someone watching a particularly satisfying story unfold. Amos continued to say nothing but had begun bringing absolutely exceptional firewood, which Inez found somehow touching. It was a Friday evening in the 8th week that the story that had been building between them reached the moment all such stories must reach, which is the moment when someone has to say the actual thing. They had ridden out together to check the south fence after supper, because one of the posts near the creek crossing had been leaning, and Louis had been meaning to look at it for a week. The sun was still up barely, and the light on the grass was the particular amber of late prairie evenings in late spring, which is a color that does not exist anywhere else in quite that way. He fixed the fence post with the efficient confidence of a man who has done this sort of thing 10,000 times, and when he was done, he did not immediately get back on his horse. He stood there at the fence line looking at the parcel beyond it, at the plum tree that was just visible in the distance, heavy with its late fruit. "I want to build the kitchen garden," he said, "this fall. I've had the plans drawn up for years." She stood beside him at the fence line. "Then build it," she said. "I want to know if you'd want it," he said, "if you'd want to use it." She looked at him. He was looking at the plum tree, his jaw set, his hands on the top rail of the fence, and she understood exactly what he was saying and what he was asking, and she understood that it was costing him something considerable to say it at all. "Louis," she said quietly. He looked at her. "I want to use it," she said. "I want to be here." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said with a careful and absolute honesty, "I have not been particularly good at being a person who lets people in. Since Clara, I have been better at keeping things out than at letting them in, and I know that. I'm not sure I know how to undo it all at once, But I want to try. With you. If that's enough to start with. She thought about Missouri and the school that had closed and the road she had been traveling for 4 years without a destination. She thought about Thomas and how loss had taught her to hold things lightly, and how that lightness had become its own kind of loneliness. She thought about a man who had not spoken his wife's name aloud in 7 years, who had carried it like something precious and unbreachable, and who had, on a Sunday evening on a porch under the first stars, led her into the room where it lived. "It's enough," she said. He reached out and tucked a strand of her hair back under her hat brim with a gentleness that was completely at odds with the roughness of his hands, and the gesture was so careful and so much itself that she felt her chest do something it had not done in a very long time. He leaned down and kissed her, there at the fence line of the south parcel, with the plum tree at some distance bearing its fruit in the evening light, and it was not a tentative kiss or a practiced one, but a true one, the kind that means something specific and is not ashamed of meaning it. When he pulled back, she was looking at him with her whole face open in a way she had not let her face be open in front of anyone for years, and he looked at her the same way, and the prairie was wide and the sky was going dark, and the creek was making its reliable sound over the stones below the crossing, and everything was very simple and very large at the same time. They rode back to the house in the prairie dark side by side, and the lights of the ranch came up through the cottonwoods like something that had been waiting. The weeks that followed were the best kind of complicated. The kind where the complication is not trouble but richness, too much to hold all at once, so it spills into the days and makes them longer and better. They were careful, because they were both careful people, and because in the West in 1878 reputations had practical consequences, and Inez understood that better than most. She was employed at the ranch, which was a specific kind of situation that required its own consideration. Louis understood this as well, and he had the directness about him that she had come to love, the quality of saying what he meant without the ornament of delay. Within 2 weeks of that evening at the fence line, he had driven into Caldwell and spoken to Reverend Gates at the small Presbyterian church, and when he came home, he found Inez in the kitchen, and he stood in the doorway and said, without preamble and with only the slightest alteration in his usual composure, "I've asked about having the bands read, if you're willing." She turned from the stove and looked at him. "That's a very direct way to propose," she said. Something shifted in his face, a softening, the particular quality of a man who is being slightly undone by his own feelings while also being somewhat helpless about it. He took a breath, and she watched him make the decision to stop being formal about it. He crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her, and he said, "Inez, I want you to be my wife. I want to build the kitchen garden with you and wake up with you in the house that I built on this land and have a life with you here that is everything I was trying to make when I first came west. I want all of it. And I know I am not the easiest man to. I know I have been closed up for a long time. But you have made me want to be open again, and I don't think I have words enough for what that means, so I will just ask you plainly. Will you marry me?" Inez set down her spoon, looked at this man whom she had known for 8 weeks, and understood in that deep, wordless way that some people understand each other, whom she had watched thaw from something sealed and still into something real and warm, whom she had told about Thomas and who had told her about Clara and who had held her hand on a porch under the first stars, and she said, "Yes." He took her face in both his rough and careful hands and kissed her, and the kitchen was warm, and the bread she had forgotten about in the oven was just beginning to go golden, and outside the window the Kansas sky was blue and wide, and entirely indifferent to the smallness of this moment, which was not small at all. Darnell found out from Amos, who had apparently overheard something from a vantage point he did not disclose, and he whooped loud enough to startle the horses in the near corral, and then collected himself and spent the rest of the day in a state of radiant satisfaction. They were married in Caldwell on a clear June morning by Reverend Gates, with Amos and Darnell as witnesses and Hector Prout in attendance, because he had been told and apparently decided to come on principle. Inez wore a dress of pale blue that she had made herself over the previous 2 weeks, and Louis wore his best coat and a clean hat, and looked at her when she came into the church with an expression that he had never in his life worn in public, but apparently could not keep off his face. The ceremony was brief and without flourish, because neither of them required flourish, and when it was done, Reverend Gates pronounced them husband and wife with the satisfied air of a man who has just contributed something of genuine value to the world, and Louis Turner kissed his wife, his second wife, and the word wife lived in his mouth differently now, not as a thing to be protected from the air but as a thing to be said, and she kissed him back. And Darnell made another sound that required him to look at the ceiling for a moment. They drove back to the ranch in the good afternoon, Inez on the seat beside him, his hand covering hers on her knee, and the ranch came up through the cottonwoods as it always did, but it looked different to her now. It was hers in the way that places become yours when you have decided to belong to them. That summer was warm and full of work, and the particular happiness of people who have found each other after years of not finding, who are therefore conscious of the happiness in a way that makes it more vivid than ordinary happiness, like something seen in bright light. They built the kitchen garden together through the summer, Louis digging the beds with Darnell's help, and Inez planning the plantings with the systematic pleasure of someone who has always thought in terms of what things could grow into. By August they had tomatoes and squash and enough dried peppers to last the winter, and the plum tree was bearing its fruit as it had done for 7 years. But that August the fruit became jam and pie and something that went with supper, and was remarked on appreciatively by Amos, who was the least expressive person at the table, and therefore the most meaningful in his appreciation. One evening in September, Louis was out on the porch after supper and Inez came to stand beside him, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into him in the easy, habitual way of people who have found the right fit. And he said, in the quiet way he had of saying important things, "I talked to Clara's parents. In May, before I asked you, I wrote to them. I wanted to, I felt I should tell them that there was someone, that I was well." Inez looked up at him. "They wrote back," he said. "They were glad." She took his hand where it rested on her shoulder and held it, and he turned and pressed his lips to her hair, and the evening settled around them, warm and particular. The fall came on with its own beauty, the Kansas autumn, which is a severe and serious beauty, all wide sky and golden grass, and the smell of coming cold on the northern wind. The cattle drives had wound down for the season and Caldwell quieted somewhat, as it always did, and the ranch settled into its winter preparations with the practiced efficiency of a place that has been through many winters. It was in October that Inez realized she was expecting a child, and she sat with this knowledge for 2 days while she determined how she felt about it, which took far less time than she expected, which was to say that she felt a joy that was clean and certain, and somewhat overwhelmed her when it arrived. On the 3rd morning she told Louis over breakfast, setting his coffee down and saying it plainly, which was how she had learned they both preferred to say things. His face did something she had not seen it do before. It went through several things in rapid succession, something like disbelief, something like awe, something like a man who has just been shown that a room he thought was permanently dark had a window in it after all. He stood up from the table and pulled her to him, and she felt against her hair that his breathing was unsteady. "Are you certain?" he said. "I am," she said. He held her for a long time in the morning kitchen, and she could feel in the particular way he held her something that she recognized as a person who had held something precious and lost it and was now, years later, being asked to hold something precious again, and finding that the hands had not forgotten how. The winter was gentle by Kansas standards, and Inez grew with the slow, purposeful certainty of a woman who was feeling well and doing exactly what she intended to do with her life. She continued the household accounts and the cooking, though Darnell had taken to appearing in the kitchen at inconvenient moments to carry things that she had been perfectly capable of carrying herself, which she found more touching than annoying, and which Louis found appropriate. Louis was different that winter. Not dramatically different. He was still a quiet man, still fundamentally formed of that careful, considered stillness that was his particular nature, but the sealed quality was gone. The sense of a covered well. He was open in small and consistent ways that mattered more than any large gesture, because they were constant. He told her things. Not always large things, but things. The history of a particular piece of land, the memory of what Caldwell had looked like in 1869, when it was only a handful of buildings and ambition. He talked about the war once, briefly, not in detail, but enough to let her see the shape of it and what it had taken. And she listened without flinching, and he was grateful for that in a way she could see in his face. He began talking about Clara sometimes, not often, and never with the careful avoidance he had once exercised, but the way you talk about someone who was real and mattered, and is part of the history that made you who you are. He talked about how she had laughed, how she had argued with him about the placement of the bedroom window, how she had made the most remarkable soup from absolutely nothing. Inez received these memories as what they were, not competition, not shadow, but the honest past of a man she loved, which she respected because she respected him. One evening she said, "I'm glad you say her name now." He looked at her. "I can hear in your voice when you say it that it's not hurting the way it did," she said, "that it's just her name again." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's because of you." She shook her head. "It's because of you," she said. "You did the work of it. I just happened to be here when you were ready." He looked at her with those clear green eyes that still, after all these months, had the capacity to make her feel seen in the particular way that is different from merely being looked at. "No," he said. "That's not exactly right either. You were not just here. You came in and you didn't demand anything of me and you didn't treat me like I was broken, and you were so exactly yourself from the first day that it reminded me that being oneself was possible, that people could be whole and real and present. I had forgotten that." She looked at him across the kitchen table in the lamplight. "Louis Turner," she said softly. "Inez Turner," he said, and he smiled. It was the slow, real smile she had seen develop over months, the one that started in his eyes before it reached his mouth, and it changed his face entirely into something she was certain she would never stop being glad of. In April of 1879, she gave birth to a boy. The birth was long, and Louis was beside himself with a fear that he kept under control by the same force of will that he applied to everything, though it showed in the way he stood in the hall when the midwife had sent him out of the room, and in the way his hands were not quite steady when it was finally done, and the cry of a living child filled the house. Darnell, who had been waiting in the kitchen for 6 hours and had drunk enough coffee to fuel a cattle drive, made a sound that was something between a sob and a laugh, and then went and checked on the horses, because he needed to do something and the horses were available. Amos said, "Good," and went to split wood, which was how Amos handled every emotion, including apparently this one. Louis came into the room where Inez lay in the bed with their son in her arms, and he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at this small, objecting, thoroughly alive person, and then at Inez, who was tired in a way that went all the way down, but who was looking at him with an expression of such uncomplicated joy that it hit him like weather. He took his son carefully in those hands that were rough and careful in equal measure, and held him in the certain way of a person who is not going to drop this thing, who is fully present for it, and who is prepared for whatever comes next. "What shall we call him?" Inez said. He thought about it for a moment. Then he looked at her. "James," he said, "for your father." She had told him once, one of those evenings, that her father had been named James, and that she had loved him very much before a fever had taken him when she was 12. "If you want." She looked at her husband holding their son in the lamplight of their bedroom in the house on the land he had built from nothing, and she said, "James." James Turner was a loud and decisive infant who had his father's green eyes and his mother's quick attention, and who caused Darnell to become a devoted and slightly ridiculous secondary caregiver who could frequently be found on the porch making faces for the baby's entertainment. The spring moved into summer, and the summer was abundant. The kitchen garden was a genuine success, the first full season of it, and Inez grew things in it that she had planned the winter before: squash and beans, and a row of sunflowers along the east border, because she wanted them there and Louis had not offered any objection. And the tomatoes came in so well that she was making preserves for 3 days in August and gave 24 jars to Hector Prout, who received them with the gruff pleasure of a man who is touched, but considers it important not to show it too openly. The plum tree bore its fruit, as it always did, and this year Inez and Louis went to the south parcel together one afternoon, James in arms, and picked the fruit together. And Louis stood there a moment in the shade of that tree that he had planted the spring of 1871 with his hands full of plums, and looked at his wife and son, and let himself feel, without editing, the full complexity of what this moment was, the grief that was part of it, and the joy that was also part of it. Not competing but coexisting the way things do in a life honestly lived. "She would have liked you," he said. Inez looked at him. "I like to think so," she said. He looked at the tree, then at her. "She'd have liked this," he said, meaning all of it. "She liked things that were alive and growing. She'd have said it was about time." Inez laughed, and the sound of it went out over the creek parcel in the summer afternoon, and James, apparently in agreement, made a sound of his own. George Breckenridge made one final attempt at the land that fall, not through legal filings this time, but through an offer delivered at the general store in Caldwell that was twice what he had previously offered, a number large enough to suggest both desperation and the particular discomfort of a man who does not like losing. Louis declined with the same 2 words he had always used, which were, as Hector Prout later reported with considerable satisfaction, delivered with a courtesy that was so absolute it was almost unkind. Breckenridge sold his own spread to a cattle consortium from Missouri the following spring and removed himself from the county entirely, and the land he left behind was absorbed by neighbors over the following years without drama. And this resolution, while not exciting, was the best kind of resolution, being complete and permanent and requiring nothing further from anyone. The following years at the Turner Ranch had the quality of good wood, dense and sturdy, with the occasional dramatic grain, beautiful in the way of things that have been built to last and know it. Their life settled into itself with the deep satisfaction of a thing fitted properly to its purpose. Louis Turner was not transformed, exactly, into someone he had not been. He remained a quiet man, fundamentally, still more comfortable with action than with words, still prone to expressing things through gestures, wood carried to the right place, a fence fixed before she could mention it was leaning, a specific book left on the kitchen table because he had read a passage in it and thought she would want to see it. But the sealed quality was gone, and what had been in its place was something more like a man who had come back to himself after a long absence and found that he was glad to be here. He laughed more. Not constantly, not in the voluminous way of men who make noise wherever they go, but the laugh was real when it came and came more often, and the sound of it never stopped delighting her. He had opinions about everything now, including the novel she was reading, which he had read before her and felt strongly about, and was willing to say so with the particular conviction of a reader who has taken the thing personally. He was a good father. This surprised no one who knew him, and would have surprised anyone who had known him only in those sealed and solitary years. James grew up in the certain knowledge that he was loved and wanted, and that his father's reserve was not indifference but its opposite, an attention so constant and so careful that it sometimes made the boy feel, in his small-child way, like the most seen person in any room. In 1882, when James was 3, Inez told Louis she was expecting again, and this time he received the news with the different fear of a man who has done this once and knows the specific terrain of it, less frantic, more solemn, deeply grateful. They had a daughter in the winter of 1882. She was born in a snowstorm of moderate intensity that Amos later described as "not the worst we've had," in a tone that suggested a personal familiarity with snowstorms so extensive that he rated them like seasons. She was small and extremely determined from the beginning, and they named her Eleanor, which was the name of Louis's mother, and called her Ellie, which she abbreviated herself to Nell by the time she could speak with any authority, and which she insisted on with a firmness that suggested she had always known her own mind and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Nell had her mother's quick brown eyes and her father's stillness, which in her expressed itself not as reserve but as the particular intensity of a person who is watching everything and cataloging it for future use. She was devoted to James with a ferocious loyalty that sometimes expressed itself through biting, which was addressed as a behavioral matter while being privately appreciated as an indicator of character. The Turner Ranch continued to grow through the early 1880s as the cattle market remained strong and Louis's careful, methodical approach to land management paid the dividends that methodical approaches tend to pay over time. He took on 2 more permanent hands and hired a seasonal crew for the drives. He bought the parcel to the east when it came available in 1883 and brought Inez with him to look at it before he bought it, walking the land together the way they had walked together that evening at the south fence all those years before, and she said the east exposure would be good for expanding the kitchen garden, and he said he had thought the same thing, and they bought it. Hector Prout died in 1883 in his sleep of old age and contentment, according to the physician in Caldwell, which was as good an ending as anyone could construct for a life. He left his livery to the young man who had been working for him, and Louis went to the funeral and Inez went with him, and at the graveside he said quietly, "He told you I was the best cattle man in the county." "He said some would say so," she corrected. "Yes," he said. "He always qualified his compliments. It was honest of him." "It was," she agreed and took his arm, and they walked back to the buckboard in the clear autumn afternoon. Darnell married a young woman from Caldwell named Rose who had come west with her family from Pennsylvania and had the specific competence and humor of a person who has decided that the West is perfectly fine and intends to manage it accordingly. They married in 1884 and took a small piece of land adjacent to the Turner Ranch, and Darnell remained as foreman, which he had been promoted to in 1881. And which he managed with a warmth and attention that made him very good at it. Rose and Inez became the kind of friends that women in that country become, woven into each other's daily lives the way the creek is woven into the land, necessary and shaping. Amos remained at the ranch until 1885, when he announced without much preamble that he was returning to Texas to be near his sister, who had apparently written to him a significant number of times on the subject. He left with the wages he had been carefully saving and the appreciation of everyone, which he accepted by shaking hands and saying he'd had good work and fair dealings, which for Amos was a speech of considerable length and sentiment. Louis wrote him a letter of character so thorough and so specific about Amos's skills and worth that Amos read it 3 times before folding it into his coat pocket, with a care that suggested it was going with him. The ranch took on a new hand to replace Amos, a young man from a Wichita family who was good with horses and had no strong opinions about firewood aesthetics, which Inez felt was perhaps a loss but not a critical one. James Turner grew into a boy of serious intelligence and outdoor competence that came from growing up on a working ranch, which is to say he could ride well and mend a fence and read a surveying map before he was 10, and he had read every book in his father's office by the time he was 12 and had opinions about most of them, and some of these opinions matched his father's and some of them didn't. And the arguments they had about books over supper were the kind of arguments that are not really arguments, but are a form of love between people who have the same quality of mind and the pleasure of finding it in each other. Nell grew into herself with a directness and conviction that was entirely her own and somewhat alarming in a child under 4 feet tall. She decided at the age of 7 that she wanted to learn the ranch accounts, and Inez, who had kept them for years and found her daughter sitting at the kitchen table studying the ledger one afternoon with the focused expression of a person conducting research, sat down beside her and taught her, because there was no reasonable argument against it, and Inez had never seen a good reason to limit what a woman might learn to do. Louis found them at the table one evening, both of them bent over the ledger, and he stood in the doorway for a moment looking at them. He had a look on his face that Inez, glancing up, recognized as one of his particular joys, the quiet, private, profound kind that he sometimes had when he did not know she was watching. She stored it away with the others, the collection she had been keeping since the first evening he had told her about Sunday and bread. In the winter of 1886, when James was 7 and Nell was 4, Inez found herself expecting their 3rd child. The winter was cold but not brutal, and she spent it the way she spent most winters, cooking and mending and keeping accounts and reading by the fire in the evenings with Louis beside her. And if she was slower about certain things and required more of the chair with the armrests and less of the one without, this was managed by everyone with the practiced ease of a household that had done this before. Their 3rd child was a son, born in the spring of 1887, and they named him Oliver, and he had Inez's dark hair and Louis's green eyes, and an absolutely untroubled temperament that seemed to find the world a broadly satisfactory place, which was a quality that both of his parents found refreshing and Nell found mildly suspicious, having not yet encountered it in herself. Oliver Turner grew up in the security of a household that was full and warm and honest, with a father whose quiet contained not absence but presence, a mother whose intelligence and practicality were as constant as the kitchen fire, an older brother who taught him to read before the school in Caldwell was ready to, and an older sister who was opinionated about everything and devoted to him, despite the opinions. In the particular way that older siblings are devoted when they have decided someone is worth the investment. The Caldwell of the late 1880s was changing, as the West was changing, the cattle drives beginning to decline as the railheads moved, and the range wars settled into their eventual outcomes, and the open range closed itself with barbed wire mile by mile. Louis had seen it coming and had adjusted, as he adjusted to everything, with the practical attention of a man who respects what is real and plans accordingly. He had been diversifying the ranch since the early 80s, putting more into wheat and the kitchen garden parcels and the breeding operation for horses, which were always in demand and less subject to the boom-bust of the cattle market. By 1888, the Turner Ranch was a genuinely prosperous operation, not wealthy by Eastern standards but wealthy by Western ones, which meant that the land was good and the work was sound, and the debts were small, and the family had everything it needed and some of what it wanted, and the future was something to lean toward rather than just survive. On a Sunday morning in the fall of 1888, Inez sat at the kitchen table with Oliver in her lap going over the morning accounts, while the smell of breakfast was still in the kitchen, and the sound of Louis and James working on something in the barn came through the window. Nell was outside somewhere, conducting some investigation or other. The Sunday morning had that good weight that Sunday mornings have when they are full of familiar sound and no particular urgency. Louis came in from the barn, wiping his hands on his work rag, and said something to James that made the boy laugh, and then came into the kitchen and looked at Inez and Oliver and the ledger, and he stood there for a moment with that private, particular look she had been collecting for a decade. "What?" she said, smiling, because she knew that look. "Nothing," he said, which was not true but was not the point. He came and pressed his lips to the top of her head, and then sat in the chair beside her and pulled the ledger toward him and looked at the column she had been working on, And they went through the numbers together the way they did every Sunday morning. 2 people at a table that had been a table of one for too long and was now exactly the right size. Oliver, in Inez's lap, reached for the pencil with the purposeful determination of a 1-year-old, who has decided that whatever the adults have is probably better than whatever he currently has. And Louis redirected the small, determined hand with a patience and ease that was, to anyone watching, the answer to a question they might not have known to ask. Outside the window, the Kansas morning was doing what Kansas mornings do in autumn, all wide sky and golden light, and that particular clear quality of the air that feels like an apology for the summer's heat. And the cottonwoods along the creek were turning, their leaves gone yellow and papery, ready to let go. Inez looked at her husband at the kitchen table and at her son in her lap, and listened to her older son's voice coming from the barn and her daughter's footsteps on the porch. And she thought about a woman who had ridden into Caldwell in the spring of 1878 with a carpetbag and a determination to find something steady, something that would hold. She had found steady. She had found more than steady. She had found a man sealed up like a covered well, and she had not tried to pry him open, because she had known you couldn't pry open a well without ruining the water. She had just been herself, and he had opened like new ground in spring, and what had come up was everything grief and joy and the plans he had carried for years, and she had been the kitchen garden and the plum tree and the Sunday bread and all of it, and he had been the same for her in his own way, the land that held her roots and let them go deep. Louis looked up from the ledger and found her watching him and raised his eyebrows slightly. "I was just thinking," she said, "about the accounts." "About everything," she said. He looked at her, and the smile came the way it always came, slowly, starting in his eyes, and she thought, as she always thought, that it was still the most valuable thing she had ever found in Kansas, more valuable than the land and the cattle and the kitchen garden and all of it. He took her free hand where it rested on the table, covered it with his, and turned back to the ledger. Outside, the cottonwoods were letting go of their leaves one at a time, each one going in its own direction on the fall wind, and the Kansas sky was so large and so blue above the ranch that it seemed like an argument for the sufficiency of the world, offered freely to anyone with the patience to look up. James came into the kitchen from the barn and announced that one of the horses had figured out the north stall latch again, and could someone please come look at it. And Louis sighed in the way of a man whose horse is smarter than the hardware keeping it contained, and stood up with Oliver now on his arm, because the baby had made his position on the matter clear by reaching up. And he carried his youngest son out to the barn with the certain and easy grace of a man who knows exactly where he is and exactly where he wants to be. Nell came in from the porch with leaves in her hair and a look of scientific purpose that suggested she had been investigating something and had reached preliminary conclusions, and she sat down at the table with her mother and looked at the ledger and said, "The South pasture numbers are better this year." "They are," Inez said. "Because the fencing held," Nell said, with the satisfaction of someone whose grasp of cause and effect is already exceptionally developed for her age. "Because the fencing held," Inez confirmed. She looked out the window at the barn, where the sound of her husband's voice reached her, steady and warm, talking to their oldest son about the latch mechanism, and whether they needed new hardware or whether ingenuity on the horse's part required ingenuity on their part in response. The sound of his voice, full and present and entirely unguarded, was something she would never take for granted because she knew what it had cost to become that, and she knew the exact quality of the silence it had replaced. He had not spoken his first wife's name in 7 years, and then he had broken open like new ground, not broken as in ruined, but broken as in plowed, as in ready, as in turned over and exposed to the light and the rain and whatever was going to come up from it. And what had come up was this. This Sunday morning and these children and this life and this particular quality of the Kansas light, which was doing what it always did, which was to make everything look like it was worth something, which it was. Inez Whitaker Turner closed the ledger and sat at her kitchen table in the home she had made from a room off a kitchen, and a careful, incremental offering of herself to a man who had learned, because of her, that the well was not empty, that opening the cover didn't mean losing the water, that it meant finally being able to drink. The ranch would go on. The accounts would balance. The plum tree would bear its fruit next summer, and the summer after, as it had since 1871, and the kitchen garden would be planted in spring as it was every spring, and James would grow into a young man with his father's eyes and his mother's intelligence, and carry this land forward into whatever the next century would bring. Nell would carry the accounts with the firm conviction that numbers were honest and could be trusted, which was more than could be said for most things. Oliver would meet the world with his steady, reasonable goodwill and probably make everyone around him slightly calmer, which was a gift. And on Sunday mornings in perpetuity, Louis Turner would come in from the barn and sit at the kitchen table with his wife, and they would go over the numbers together, and he would take her hand and cover it with his, rough and careful in equal measure, and the house would be warm and the sky outside would be that Kansas blue, and the names they carried, Clara, Thomas, the young hopeful people they had been, would live alongside the living names, not as shadow but as ground, as the soil that made the garden possible. The door opened and Louis came back in with Oliver on his arm and James behind him, and he looked at Inez and Nell at the table and said, "The horse is smarter than the hardware again." And James said, "I told you." And Nell said, "I could have told you that." And Oliver said nothing because he was 1 year old but looked enormously pleased about the general situation. Inez laughed and Louis' smile happened, slow and real, and he put their youngest son in the chair with a gentle certainty and turned to the stove to see about the coffee, and the kitchen filled with the sound of them all, and outside the window the Kansas autumn did what it had always done without requiring anything of anyone, simply being the beautiful, indifferent, sufficient world. And it was enough. It was, in fact, everything.